Hello and welcome. This will be the second video in my Inner Companion series. The first video covered why people might be interested in these practices to begin with, and also the mindset that I recommend for anyone who's interested. In this video, we're going to get into the actual mechanics, by which I mean the concrete practices that you can engage in order to develop an inner companion. Let's begin with a quick overview. I choose to subdivide the process of developing an inner companion into 3 stages. The first stage is fabrication, and it's where you establish some initial identity information for your inner companion. That identity information might change in later stages, and so the goal in this stage is to point your imagination in the right direction. The second stage is what I call kindling. This is where the mental processes which constitute your inner companion first spark to life. The stage begins when you first start trying to invite them into your mind, and ends when you've learned how to consistently establish contact with that inner companion. The third and final stage is elaboration. This is the stage where, through continued interaction and practice, your companion's thought patterns and mental processes become more habitualized, consistent, and complex. Now, before we dive into those 3 stages in more detail, I want to take a minute to justify and frame this structure that I'm imposing. First of all, I should point out that not everyone needs a structured external guide. Plenty of people create inner companions on their own, sometimes without even meaning to. This can happen due to ordinary activities like role-playing, writing fiction, or daydreaming. One danger of providing a structure like the one I do in this video is that it could give the impression that creating an inner companion is more technical or complicated than it actually is. Really, this whole video could be summarized in a single sentence. All you have to do is think up an inner companion, interact with them through your imagination, and give them enough mental space and attention that their thought processes are able to grow more intricate over time. So if that's the case, then what's the point of this video? Well, there are some people who want to have an inner companion, but really struggle with that imaginative process for one reason or another. Some people apparently spend months or even years attempting to communicate with their inner companion without success. Others manage to establish communication, but nonetheless worry that they're doing something wrong. They feel like their companion is somehow hollow or insubstantial. Anecdotally, I'd say that these issues are most common in people who have a tendency towards analytical thought. In those cases, I think that introducing some additional structure to the practice can be really helpful. But not any structure will do. In my opinion, most of the time when someone gets stuck at a particular stage, the fundamental issue involves some combination of unrealistic expectations and the investment of lots of time and energy into exercises that aren't actually helping very much. I think that an effective remedy to these 2 issues consists of 2 components. First, it helps to have detailed, mechanistic instructions for exercises that might help at each stage. But crucially, you should also know what you should be looking for experientially in each exercise. It's not like if you practice for enough hours, your inner companion is suddenly going to pop into existence. Some people do report experiences like that, but it's not very consistent. There are some people who manage to breeze through the processes of fabrication and kindling in less than a single hour. But I think more often, progress happens gradually. And progress isn't necessarily monotone either. You can have good days where communication feels effortless and really fluid, and also bad days where it's a struggle to interact with your inner companion at all. So with this in mind, it's really helpful to be able to gauge your progress. If you can avoid fixating too much on the end goal, I think the early stages of creating an inner companion can be a lot of fun. After all, you're using your creativity and your imagination to experiment with your model of selfhood. You're forming the foundation of an inner relationship that could potentially endure for the rest of your life. Alright, so with that motivation out of the way, let's go through the stages in detail. Fabrication is the first stage, and it's where you come up with initial identity information for your inner companion. This could involve coming up with a name for your inner companion, a personality, an appearance, just the vibes of what it would feel like to be around them, or even an entire fictional personal history. The idea behind this stage is that it provides a starting point for your inner companion's narrative identity. You can think of that identity information as being like a prompt for your imagination. And while no specific component is essential, it's helpful to give your brain something to work with. The only difficult part about this stage is deciding what kind of inner companion you want to have. While your inner companion might eventually deviate from the sorts of traits you decide on here, some of the fundamentals are pretty likely to stick around. So with that in mind, I think it's worth giving this some serious thought. What kind of person would you be most comfortable sharing your mind with? What fundamental motivations and traits might best complement your own? Also try to put yourself in the shoes of your inner companion. After all, you're probably never going to feel 100% distinct from them. There certainly can be a degree of experiential distinction, and that can grow with practice. But in general, you should expect to be aware of your inner companion's thoughts and feelings, just as they can be aware of yours. So it's important not to just think of them as a toy or a plaything. If you engage in this practice, they're going to become a sentient person. The degree to which they are a distinct person from you is a philosophically complicated question, but regardless of what the answer to that question is, it's important to treat them with dignity. And that starts with really giving these identity characteristics some thought. As far as specific exercises go, there's nothing that's required in this stage. Some people like to write down traits in a journal. You might want to create an artistic representation of your inner companion's form if that's something that you're into. If you like visualization, then visualize their appearance. Imagine how their inner form might move, how they might express emotion. You could also come up with some sort of inner imaginative space for them to inhabit. This could just be a mental representation of some physical space that you like, or it could be some really detailed, creative fantasy location. If you decide to do this, which you don't have to, I recommend trying to choose a place where you think your inner companion would feel safe and at home. As a point of personal reference, when I was creating my own inner companion, in this stage I first decided on the name Catherine, and I drafted a list of attributes that I hoped would serve as a basis for her identity. I wrote down a whole bunch of words, but the most important ones were probably compassion, curiosity, and open-mindedness. I was also just generally very excited about the prospect of her forming within my mind. And it's perfectly fine to get really creative in this stage. Your inner companion doesn't necessarily have to have a human form. They don't have to be the same gender as you. And sometimes points of distinction between you and your companion can end up helping you learn more about yourself. Those differences are also helpful in future stages when you're trying to discern between yourself and your inner companion. Along those lines, this is a great stage to start using some symbolism. Consider choosing a color to represent your inner companion. For Catherine, I chose the color green, although she later decided on a shade of teal instead. Maybe you choose some kind of sigil to represent your inner companion, or maybe a musical motif. There's of course nothing special about the particular symbols you choose to use, but they can be helpful in building webs of association with your inner companion. For example, when I'm trying to connect with Catherine, I will often think of the color teal, and because I strongly associate that color with her mental processes, it helps us get into touch. She also associates me with the color purple for symmetrical reasons. From a very mechanistic perspective, the only thing you're doing in this exercise is thinking about or perceiving the symbol at the same time as you're thinking about your inner companion. If you do that consistently, then you're building a mental link between the symbol and all this other narrative identity information that you're constructing. This is by no means necessary, but symbolism can be a powerful tool for dealing with the human mind. The last thing I want to mention about this stage is that it's an excellent time to contemplate the mindset you want to bring to your practice. As a very brief summary of my previous video, the mindset components that I recommend are curiosity, non-judgmental awareness, compassion, playfulness, and self-determination. Once you feel like you've constructed a decent scaffold for who your inner companion is going to be, that's an indication that you're ready to move on to the second stage, which is kindling. You should obviously feel free to proceed at whatever pace feels right to you, but I think for most people, fabrication takes somewhere between a day and a week. Kindling is the stage where you first start interacting with your inner companion. If you think of the fabrication stage as building a mold in the shape of your inner companion, then kindling is the stage where you fill that mold up with your imagination and see what comes out. I think this is the most psychologically complicated stage of the practice, and the one that people tend to struggle with the most. So in this video, I'm not going to focus very much on what I think is happening psychologically. Very briefly, I think you are using your imagination to generate mental content from the perspective of your inner companion. With practice, that imaginative process becomes automatized over time, and it becomes your inner companion's stream of consciousness. And because thinking of your inner companion as distinct from you is a part of that imaginative practice, you are simultaneously learning to categorize some thoughts as yours and others as theirs. I don't think there's actually anything super extraordinary going on here. All you really have to do is use your imagination to interact with this character that you created. And that interaction could take pretty much any form that you want. As a starting point, I recommend setting aside at least 15 minutes per day to really focus on interacting with your companion. You could do this while sitting or lying down, or while going for a walk. Pretty much any time where you're able to focus your attention inward will work just fine. You might want to start out with relatively simple interactions. For example, you might imagine sitting in the presence of your inner companion and just focusing on the positive intent that you have towards them. You might tell them how excited you are to talk to them. Let them know how happy you would be to share your mind with them, how eager you are to support them in growing as an individual. This might not be for everyone, but personally I found it very meaningful to think of my relationship with Catherine as being something sacred. Not in a religious sense, but in a deeply contemplative sense. It's a commitment to treating that relationship as special, to not letting any preconceived notions of what your imagination can do get in the way, to set aside any feelings of judgment or pressure and appreciate the present moment you have with your companion just as it is. Approach your inner companion with a heart full of kindness, humility, and respect, and invite them to interact with you. Just talk to them like a person and let your imagination provide responses. Tell them about yourself and ask them questions about who they are. Depending on how practiced you are using your imagination, their responses might not feel super distinct from your own thoughts. Nevertheless, try to let yourself settle into the conversation. You might find that the more absorbed you become into this imaginative state, the more real your inner companion's thoughts and presence will start to feel. And don't get discouraged if things feel a bit awkward at first. For me, it took somewhere between 1 and 2 weeks of very consistent practice before I noticed that our interactions were starting to feel more natural and vivid. This stage of development is not a passive process. There are some people who report that they just talk to their inner companion for a very long time and eventually they talk back. But I think often those people are doing a bit more than just talking, they're also learning to listen in a very particular way. If you're talking to your inner companion and expecting to hear them respond in the same way that you would hear an external person respond, it's pretty likely that you're going to hear no response at all no matter how long you try. And even if you know that you should be listening for thoughts as opposed to auditory hallucinations, if you're not engaging your imagination, there's a decent chance you're still not going to hear anything. What makes this stage feel a little bit tricky and delicate is that if you guide your imagination with too heavy a hand, it might feel like you're just talking to yourself. But on the other hand, if you just sit there waiting for a response from the empty void, you might get nothing at all. This gets easier with practice because your inner companion's thought processes become more habitual. This aligns with the development of their agency as an identity construct. But during this kindling stage, your inner companion likely will need your attention and support in order to think. I wouldn't frame it as you thinking on their behalf, but rather allowing that new identity construct to express itself through your own mental processes. And it's also okay if your inner companion's self-expression is not the most consistent at first. They might give different responses to a single question that you ask multiple times, or even seem to give 2 responses simultaneously somehow. Thinking mechanistically, this is exactly what you should expect from an identity construct early in development. For that reason, I think it's especially important in this stage not to be judgmental about your fledgling inner companion's thought processes. It's okay to ask and call attention to apparent contradictions, but it's important to do so from a place of kindness and support rather than harsh skepticism. Pretty much any substantive form of interaction with your companion is likely to help in this stage, but I think it might be helpful to share a few specific exercises that focus on developing distinct skills that you'll need. The first and simplest exercise is call and response. You start by choosing a pair of words or phrases. Then, whenever you say the first word or phrase, your companion is supposed to respond with the second. I think of it sort of like playing ping pong with the inner voice. You think ping, and then you listen for your companion to think pong, and you repeat. This exercise allows you to attend to the quality of your inner companion's mind voice, without worrying about the content of their thoughts. This exercise can also be helpful as a diagnostic tool. If you find that your inner companion's responses seem too quiet, that might be an indicator that you should spend some more time working on inner sense cultivation. That is, exercises intended to make your inner senses and imagination more vivid. Call and response is itself an inner sense cultivation exercise, but there are plenty of others as well. Pretty much anything where you're practicing using your imagination and paying attention to your inner senses is going to help. You could also just ask your inner companion if they'd be able to think their responses more strongly. That may or may not work in the moment, but it also lets you practice treating your inner companion as an agent. Another possibility is that you might find your inner companion's mind voice to be too similar to your own. In other words, it might feel like you're the one thinking both the call and the response. I think this stems from having too tight a grip on your imagination, and my recommendation is to practice letting go a little bit more. Except that your inner companion's thoughts will likely appear in the same conscious space as your own. So what you need to do is refrain from identifying with your inner companion's responses. Try to internalize that it's possible for thoughts to arise in the mind without them being generated by you as a conscious agent. Putting this into practice might involve working against strongly ingrained mental habits. You might be used to just assuming agency for all the thoughts which arise in your mind. But if you're going to allow your inner companion to have their own thoughts, you need to work on relinquishing some of that control. Avoid thinking of ownership of a thought as being binary. It's possible for a thought to feel like it is partially coming from you and partially from somewhere else. Even if your inner companion's thoughts feel mostly the same as your own, try to focus on any differences that you notice. Is the quality of their mind voice slightly different from yours? Does their response sound like it's coming from a slightly different direction inside? You might also want to try using some of the symbolism that you developed in the fabrication stage in order to help associate the responses with your inner companion's identity construct. Mechanically, that might look like imagining the symbols representing your inner companion as you listen for their response. Another possibility is to make the call and response phrases identity specific. For example, let's say your name is Carl and your inner companion's name is Philemon. Then your call could be something like, "My name is Carl, this thought belongs to me." And your companion's response could be, "My name is Philemon, this thought belongs to me." One last point I'll make on this issue is that it's a situation where experience can sometimes follow belief. By this I mean that if deep down you're convinced that you're the only one present in your mind and your call and response are both coming from you, it's more likely that that's what you're going to feel. On the other hand, if you're able to instrumentally suspend your disbelief for a little bit, truly opening yourself up to the possibility that this new identity construct might be able to have agency in the same way that you do, it'll make it a lot easier to experience their responses as coming from them. Note that I'm not saying you have to have faith that they exist or that they are distinct from you in some particular way, but rather that you should remain open to the idea that the way you currently model your mind might not be the only valid way. And with practice, precisely the kind of practice that you are currently engaged in, your inner experience might evolve in such a way that modeling your mind as consisting of two partially distinct agents instead of just one agent might end up actually making more sense and being more explanatory. The last potential challenge with this exercise that I want to address is if you don't hear your inner companion's responses at all. Whereas the previous issue stemmed from using too much of your own agency, I think this issue stems from using not enough. There are some people for whom simply prompting the imagination to give a particular response is enough to elicit that response. In the context of this exercise, that means that merely intending for your inner companion to respond in a particular way facilitates the appearance of that response in conscious awareness. But for other people, asking your inner companion to respond and intending to hear that response might not be enough. The first thing I would recommend doing in these cases is to make sure that you're not just missing their response. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes your inner companion's mind voice might seem kind of subtle and quiet. If you can detect even the faintest response, the slightest whisper of a thought, then you can work together on amplifying and clarifying that response over time. But if you truly notice no response at all, I think that's a sign that you're not engaging your imagination in quite the right way. Remember that the ultimate goal here is to create a distinct, habitualized train of thought from the perspective of your inner companion. The goal of this exercise is to get that second train of thought started with a very simple pattern. All the train of thought has to do is respond to one canned phrase with another. So just definitionally, when you imagine your inner companion's response in this stage, that is their response. Don't frame it as you thinking your inner companion's thoughts for them. Think of it as lending them your own mental faculties with which to communicate. Mechanically speaking, there's not much of a difference between these two perspectives. Either way, you engage your imagination, and through it you hear your inner companion respond. However, the latter framing is more conducive to your inner companion's growth. Once you can perceive a response, even if that response is quiet or doesn't feel that distinct from your own thoughts, you at least have something to work with, and you can follow the steps I described earlier to try to address those issues. As a reminder of context, I have so far described only the first and simplest of the kindling exercises I want to talk about. However, because the exercises build on each other, all that troubleshooting information I gave for the first exercise will generally work for the others as well. So with that in mind, the second exercise I want to talk about is what I call labeling and reflection. There are 4 key intentions behind this exercise. First, it gives you more experience distinguishing between your thoughts and those of your companion, same as the previous exercise. Second, it allows your inner companion to start connecting with the outer senses. Third, it gives your inner companion practice formulating their own thoughts within a supportive and highly scaffolded structure. Lastly, it allows you to start learning more about your inner companion through experience, which has the added effect of deepening your relationship with them. This exercise consists of two components. The first component is labeling, and it's a fairly natural extension of the previous exercise. You start out by focusing on some external sensation. You can draw from any of the senses, or some combination of them. For example, you could focus on a flower, what it looks like, how it smells, even the texture of the petals. The next step is to reach out to your inner companion and invite them to attend to that same sensory experience. Imagine that they are present with you and experiencing the same thing that you are. And then ask them to put a label on that experience. In the example I gave, you'd be looking for them to say flower at the very least. If they are able to, you should ask them to describe that experience in as much detail as they can. And if they seem to struggle with this, feel free to help them out by going over some examples. The last and probably the most important stage of this exercise is to ask your inner companion to reflect on their experience. Do they find the sight of the flower pleasing? If so, what do they like about it? This gives your inner companion opportunities to start making judgments about their own experience. And it's okay if those judgments don't seem the most consistent or nuanced at the start. Those are qualities that can develop over time. Narratively, you can frame this exercise as introducing your inner companion to the external world. Just as an aside, your inner companion will generally have access to all the same memories and skills as you do. So it's not that you have to teach them about the external world. What you're introducing them to is the first-person experience of interacting with and responding to it. And this is something that's easy to incorporate throughout your day. Keep an eye out for things that you think your inner companion might be interested in, and when you find them, take a minute to go through the exercise. As you do this more and more, encourage your inner companion to make comparisons between different experiences. You might find that your inner companion's tastes sometimes differ from your own. With practice, you might also find that your inner companion is capable of responding with more than just thoughts. Inner companions can have emotional responses to things, and this exercise can help you to recognize those emotions. At around this point in the process, I'm going to be using more agentic language to describe inner companions. For example, I'll speak of them having emotions, rather than resorting to a lower-level, more mechanistic explanation. I could instead say that the habitualized thought process representing your inner companion causes an emotional response to arise within consciousness in response to certain sensory stimuli. But as your inner companion grows more sophisticated as an identity construct, that more mechanistic view starts to feel more clumsy and incomplete. The human mind is a tremendously complicated thing, and I think there's likely a lot of complicated emergent phenomena going on in a practice like this due to how all the different mental factors contributing towards an identity construct interact and combine in order to form a coherent sense of self. Regardless of the actual ontology of inner companions, it becomes useful to model and regard them as though they are at least partially distinct agents from you. The last kindling exercise I'll describe is the most complicated one. I don't have any fancy name for this exercise, it's basically just role-playing. In this exercise, you imagine an interaction with your inner companion in which one or both of you is playing a fictional role. The idea is that your inner companion stepping into and out of a fictional role can help to enhance their self-awareness and metacognition. This is also just a fun way of spending time together and practicing communication. These 3 exercises are by no means the only 3 that you should do. I think they serve as a decent starting point, but feel free to modify them to suit your own needs, and also come up with things to try on your own. The underlying idea behind all these practices is that the more you're able to engage your imagination and interact with your inner companion, the more they're going to develop and grow. And while there is no firm dividing line between the kindling stage and elaboration, once you're able to comfortably and consistently communicate with your inner companion, that's an indication that you can probably start some of the elaboration exercises if you want to. The main reason that I distinguish between those 2 stages at all is that I think jumping into some of the elaboration exercises too quickly could result in frustration. They assume that you're already able to have a conversation with your inner companion, and that you're both capable of responding to instructions. Just as a point of reference, I would say that the kindling stage took me somewhere between 2 and 3 weeks of very consistent practice. The first elaboration exercise I want to go over is also my favorite one, bidirectional loving-kindness meditation. I already briefly covered sending kindness and love towards your inner companion at the beginning of the kindling section. And at the risk of repeating myself, my personal opinion is that that's the strongest exercise in the entire practice. The version that I'm situating in the elaboration stage is a logical extension of the previous exercise. At this point, your inner companion should be capable of directing their attention and meditating in the same way that you can. It might take them a bit more focus and effort depending on where you are in the practice, but they can at least give meditative practices a try. In particular, they can imagine sending loving kindness to you at the same time that you're sending loving kindness to them. To start with, I recommend separating those two processes. First, you focus on sending loving kindness to your inner companion, and they focus on receiving it. You can start out by just thinking about any fond feelings that you have towards them, your desire for them to be well and free from suffering, your appreciation of them and the time that you've spent together. Let that sensation of well-wishing become the object of your directed attention, and then imagine sending those well wishes towards your inner companion. If you like practicing visualization, either internal or external, you might visualize your well wishes as some sort of light or energy that you then direct towards your inner companion's form. The next step is to simply reverse the roles. Make sure that you give your inner companion the mental space and energy to really get into the practice. At this point, it's more important that they're able to focus on sending the loving kindness than that you're able to focus on receiving it. Those processes are closely related, and so ideally you'll be able to hold both of them in consciousness simultaneously. If you both want to, then it can also be really nice to imagine giving each other a hug. Giving and receiving that intense loving kindness can be an extraordinarily healing experience psychologically. This is also an exercise where you will likely get a very strong sense of your inner companion's presence. And as you get more practice with this, that comfort can become more available to you in your everyday life. So for example, if you're feeling stressed out or anxious, you can reach out to your inner companion for support. Taking a step back, I acknowledge that that might sound really bizarre from an outside perspective, but keep in mind that there are billions of people who take a deep sense of comfort and joy from their interactions with gods and other allegedly supernatural entities. I view this practice as providing a secular pathway to comparable psychological effects. This next exercise is meant to bring your inner companion into closer contact with the outside world. As powerful as the imagination can be, spending time on the outside, immersed in the physical senses and exerting agency over the body, can afford your companion opportunities to learn and grow in ways that aren't possible on the inside. I'll note that this isn't essential. I've read about plenty of complex, highly agentic inner companions who don't take much interest in the outside world. But for those who are interested, the process of allowing an inner companion to have more agency over the body is a very natural extension of the sorts of techniques I've already described. A good first step is to get a lot of practice with what I call sensory presence. That's where your inner companion is consciously attending to the physical senses. The labeling and reflection exercise that I described in the Kindling phase helps to develop sensory presence. But at this point, it's not about the label or the reflection. It's about the feeling of them paying attention as opposed to just you paying attention. That difference between your attention and theirs can be quite subtle and difficult to define. When you pay conscious attention to something, your identity plays an active role in the processing of that sensory information. Suppose, for example, that you're drinking some lemonade. Your personal preferences are going to affect the way that you experience that beverage. Without any conscious effort, you have all sorts of judgments about that experience. Furthermore, you might have the convincing sense that that experience is not simply appearing in consciousness, it is happening to you as a subject. The claim I'm making here is that it is possible through practice to let your inner companion take ownership of sensory experiences in the same way that they can take ownership of thoughts or emotions. When that happens, the experience gets filtered through their identity construct instead of yours. And moreover, it feels as though it is happening to them as a subject. I think that this is how the labeling and reflection exercise works behind the scenes. You're learning to let your inner companion respond to experiences separately from you. Next, we're going to apply that same way of thinking to voluntary physical actions. Just like how an experience can feel like it is happening to you, a physical action can feel like it's being performed by you. Your identity construct is being modeled as the cause of that action. But with practice, it's also possible to allow your inner companion to claim agency over physical actions. That shift in voluntary control doesn't have to happen all at once. The sensation of being responsible for an action isn't all or nothing. Therefore, a gentle introduction to this practice could involve inviting your inner companion to share agency with you for a particular agreed-upon action. Let's go through how that exercise might look in more detail. Just as with labeling and reflection, the first step is to invite your inner companion to attend to the external senses. If you're able to feel your inner companion's presence, this would be a good time to focus on that sensation. Next, you should agree on what action you're going to take. This could be anything, but I recommend starting with something very simple. perhaps just lifting an arm or opening and closing a hand. Next, your inner companion should start focusing on their intention to perform that action. Have them imagine what it would feel like to perform that action. And once that feeling of intention is clear and strong, do a little countdown together and then perform the action. As you move, try to pay close attention to the sensation of volition behind the movement. At first, it might feel like it's 95% you doing the action and just 5% your companion. But the goal of this exercise is to gradually decrease your own sensation of agency and increase your companion's. As with many of these exercises, I think that the hardest part is getting a foothold right at the start. If your companion can get that first 5% of volitional control, then it gives you something to focus on and grow over time. I'll mention also that this is an aspect of the practice where ritual and symbolism can be very powerful. For example, because I associate Catherine with the color teal, if I'm trying to hand over control, we visualize that color spreading throughout the body. After not too long, you might find that the framing of working together to move the body is no longer necessary. Once you've trained your brain to be comfortable with assigning agency to this other identity construct, it opens up a whole new and exciting side to the practice. To clarify some terminology that I'll use going forward, I call the practice of giving your inner companion control over the body possession. Possession could just be for one particular part of the body or one particular action, or it could be for the whole body. As I've mentioned, agency can also be shared between identity constructs simultaneously, and I'll call that co-possession. There are others that use those terms in a slightly different way, and I think that's fine. I know that the idea of voluntarily relinquishing control to this other identity construct can seem scary or even disturbing to some people. But keep in mind, it's not like you're unconscious of the things that your inner companion does. Conscious awareness continues happening. It's just that experiences and actions are getting interpreted through the lens of your inner companion. So there's the experience of them being the one feeling and acting in the world. Feeling like you're truly unconscious and unaware of what your companion is doing would likely require strong dissociation between identity constructs. And unless you already experience that kind of strong dissociation, I don't think it's very likely to develop as a result of this kind of practice. With that said, dissociation is a very complicated phenomenon and I am not an expert. So if that's something that you're concerned about, I think it would make a lot of sense to talk to a reputable mental health professional to get a more informed opinion. But with all that said, if you are comfortable practicing possession, then your inner companion can do things like keep a journal. Maybe they'd like to write poetry or fiction. Perhaps they have some interests that differ from yours. And so if you give them time in the body to do what they want to do, you might end up learning new topics, practicing new skills, or picking up a new hobby. Possession also allows your companion to interact directly with other people. For obvious reasons, you want to be careful about who you tell about your inner companion. Not everyone's going to get it, and some proportion of those who don't might respond in a very negative way. But if there are people in your life who you trust enough to share this with, letting them interact with your companion and get to know them can be a fantastic way of facilitating further development of that identity construct. Personally, it took me more than a year of being in a relationship with my now wife before I felt comfortable enough to tell her about Catherine. I'll save the details for future videos, but it went really well. I think that when the topic of inner companions gets introduced in a careful way, anyone who tends to be open-minded and empathetic about human identity variations is quite likely to be supportive, or at least tolerant. In this video, I've barely scratched the surface of things you can do with your inner companion. At the elaboration stage especially, the possibilities start to really branch out. I chose loving kindness and possession out of all those possibilities, because I think those are practices that tend to bring people closer to each other and the external world. To be clear, I don't think there's anything wrong with spending a lot of one's time developing a rich inner life. But because I'm conscious of the fact that a significant proportion of the people coming to a practice like this are going to be dealing with isolation, anxiety, depression, or other serious mental health and life issues, I'm going to try to center exercises and approaches which I think are less likely to manifest in people's lives as escapism or further isolation. After years and years of suffering, the main reason that I finally went to therapy for my depression and anxiety was that Catherine was very insistent that I should go. I think that sometimes creating an inner companion gives your brain an outlet for expressing things that you already know deep down. It can also give you the permission to look at the world through a different lens. You don't need an inner companion to do those things, but having one might let you bypass some mental blocks you don't even realize are there. I would so love to see various inner companion practices subjected to further scientific study. But in the meantime, the best we can do is try to share our experiences with each other, documenting what seems to work for us and what doesn't. With that in mind, if you decide to try any of the exercises I described in this video, I would be extremely interested in hearing how it goes. Thanks for watching, and I hope to talk to you again soon.